Japanese television has always been this surreal experience where you're not quite sure what you might see next. And due to the country's history of unregulated television, it means you're bound to find some disturbing broadcasts that should have never happened. From live TV assassinations to idols being held hostage on camera, we'll be investigating them in the form of an iceberg, starting with Tier 1, then going down deeper until we get to the darkest and most unknown broadcasts in Japanese history. So let's just get straight into it. On the early morning of February 8th in 1982, Japanese residents turned on their TVs to the sight of one of their premier hotels, the Hotel New Japan, burning live on feed while rescuers and firemen scrambled to reach the residents trapped inside. What many assumed to be watching here was a fire caused by a mere unfortunate accident. But when you take a closer look, you start to see that this was actually due to something more nefarious. So let's take a closer look at the Hotel New Japan fire and what caused this horrible accident to unfold on live TV. Sometime in the very early morning between 3:20 and 3:25 am on February 8th, a British occupant in room 938 on the 9th floor had been smoking a cigarette in bed when his bedding caught fire and ignited in his room. The occupant managed to escape, but the fire spread from his bedding into the room and into the corridor. This all happened within a few minutes, but what's incredibly strange about this case is that the fire shouldn't even have made it to the corridor in the first place. The sprinklers should have gone off and stopped the fire from getting out of control, but they didn't. This was due to one man and one man only, Hideki Yokoi. Hideki acquired control of the hotel in 1979, just coming off of a decade where this hotel had fallen under some pretty hard times. Being founded in 1960, the hotel was nowhere near as prosperous as it once was when it first opened, and Hideki took advantage of that to buy the hotel now that it was cheaper, which there's nothing wrong with, but it's Hideki's business practices after the fact, once acquiring said business, that is where the problem falls. He was already notorious in Japan as an aggressive corporate raider with a reputation for ruthless cost-cutting of any business he acquired, and the Tokyo New Hotel was no different. Under his ownership, Hideki slashed staff numbers dramatically, leaving only a skeleton crew on night duty that day. But the main factor that I was just talking about a moment ago were the sprinklers. The Tokyo Fire Department had repeatedly ordered the hotel to install a new full sprinkler system, but Hideki refused, citing that it was just too costly, leaving the hotel with a sprinkler system that only covered the hotel partially, and with many of the few installed being completely non-functional, due to either not servicing them properly or performing fire drills to know that they were broken in the first place. But if it were just the sprinkler system, then at least many more people would have been able to escape. But the emergency alarm in the building was also either switched off due to having an undertrained crew, or broken due to not servicing it properly. Whichever it was, no alarms fitted into the building sounded that night, which allowed the fire to grow completely unchecked, spreading smoke rapidly all through the 9th and up to the 10th floor. At 3:35 am, the Tokyo Fire Department received around 100 calls about the hotel they'd just spent months begging to install a new sprinkler system and prepared for the worst. They arrived within just 10 minutes to one of the largest hotel fire operations in the city's history, with dozens of engines and ladder trucks. But not far behind them were the TV crews, arriving just in time to broadcast the disturbing sight of multiple guests falling from windows in an attempt to escape the building. The footage captured that day and the feed that viewers watched from home was some of the most infamous disaster imagery ever aired on Japanese television. Being there and watching it live through your screen while being unable to do anything and yet knowing it's happening live is just incredibly horrifying. But within those 9 hours, firefighters pulled out dozens of survivors from windows and balconies and finally declared the fire extinguished by midday, being praised for their heroism in stark contrast to the hotel's complete and utter negligence. 33 people died that day, many in their rooms or in corridors killed by smoke inhalation, with the rest perishing by falls in an attempt to escape. In 1987, a few years later, Hideki Yokoi was sentenced to 3 years in prison for negligence, with his conviction being upheld, leading to him passing away not too long after his release at 80 years old. On the 12th of October in 1960, TV presenters prepared to broadcast what they expected to be a normal political debate from the Hibiya Public Hall in central Tokyo. But what no one could have expected, even the countless people watching along at home, was that what they would witness that day would be an assassination broadcast live on air. The debate at Hibiya Hall featured leaders from the three main parties at the time: Asanuma for the Japan Socialist Party, the Prime Minister Akita for the Liberal Democratic Party, and Suhiro Nishio for the Democratic Socialist Party. There was a lot of turmoil in the run-up to this debate, as through spring and summer of that same year, 1960, hundreds of thousands of people protested the US-Japan Security Treaty. These were the AMPO protests that I learned about from reading Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood. The treaty had an initial 10-year renewal term, and so in the book, which is set in 1970, it talks about protesters tackling the same treaty just about 10 years later. The left anyway saw this treaty as subordination to America, while the right saw their disapproval of the treaty as the left being traitors wanting to drag Japan towards communism. Asanuma was the most vocal face on the left in opposition of the treaty, and he campaigned tirelessly, being especially hated for his views against America. On the day of the debate, Asanuma took the podium as the second speaker, in front of 2,500 attendees, press photographers, and multiple NHK TV cameras. Then, at 3:05 p.m, he began his speech, which he wouldn't even get through the first sentence of, when Otoya Yamaguchi burst out from the audience on the right side of the stage and charged at Asanuma in a full sprint while holding a short sword leveled in front of him. Yamaguchi slammed the sword into Asanuma multiple times before he would die of his wounds very shortly afterwards. Yamaguchi was 17 years old, which, if you read Norwegian Wood, you would understand is sounding about right. He was an active member of a small ultranationalist group, which he had left months before the attack, meaning he acted primarily on his own. The attack was caught by all the cameras present, and since television was brand new to most Japanese households, it meant a lot of people were tuned in and actively watching what they expected to be something of great importance, which I suppose it was, but just not for the reason they were expecting. On November 2nd, 3 weeks after the killing, Yamaguchi mixed toothpaste and water to write on his cell wall, "7 lives for my country, long live His Majesty the Emperor," which were the famous last words of the 14th century imperial loyalist Kusunoki Masahige, which you can imagine were Yamaguchi's as well, being found unresponsive in his cell just a few hours later, which turned him into a martyr in far-right circles. Just a pretty disturbing assassination with dire consequences for all involved, broadcast live on TV with everyone watching. Fuji TV is one of the most diabolical broadcasting companies in all of Japan, being featured on this channel multiple times already. But one of their most disturbing cases was the SMAP live apology broadcast in 2016. SMAP x SMAP was a long-running weekly variety show for the group SMAP, or Sports Music Assemble People, which was formed in 1988. They were managed by Johnny and Associates, which was a very controversial talent agency that controlled Japanese male pop music for decades. In January of 2016, it emerged that 4 of the 5 members had actually wanted to leave Johnny's and follow their longtime manager, Michi Ijima, who had been forced out of the agency at the time. Ijima had managed SMAP for decades and, by the group, was seen as the architect for their careers, with her removal being connected to internal power struggles. Perhaps some internally at Johnny's and Associates were worried that she would rise in the company due to the declining health of the company founder, Johnny Kitagawa, being that 4 out of the 5 members were willing to leave with her, and made this into a massive control dispute. But with the 5th and final member's decision to stay at Johnny's, it meant that the idea to leave would be completely shot down. Then, on January 18th in 2016, the 5 members then appeared on SMAP x SMAP, their own show, which is normally all fun and games, this time strangely wearing suits and standing in a row on a completely plain set. What some viewers may have expected to be a strange variety segment actually turned out to be a pretty uncomfortable watch, as the members began apologizing for suggesting that they'd even think about leaving the company. They stood there all stiff, with some members looking really distressed, which made it pretty clear to many viewers that this apology was not all voluntary, but more like a hostage video. It sparked enormous public debate about whether the broadcast was coerced or not. The image of 5 grown men standing in a row apologizing for trying to exercise the free will of choosing their own careers struck many people as deeply uncomfortable. But it's just a glimpse into the strange power structure of Japan's entertainment industry, which if you've been following this channel for a while, you'll know is just a really strange world. The group stayed together through 2016, but broke up at the end of the year, assumingly when their contracts ran out. I suppose it got a bit awkward when their boy didn't have their back like that when they wanted to leave, but we don't really have the story. That member stayed on at Johnny's as a solo talent, with the other 4 leaving the company after the founder died, only to find out that they'd been blacklisted from TV, a common Johnny's tactic to deter any talent thinking of departing the agency. Their previous manager did end up forming a new group, and they have all since rebuilt their careers, but it's just super brutal to watch that apology video, knowing that it probably wasn't consensual in the slightest. Shinzo Abe was Japan's longest-serving prime minister. At 67 years old, he was still the most powerful figure inside the then-ruling Liberal Democratic Party, despite resigning as prime minister at the time due to health concerns. You're probably familiar with this case, as what we're about to discuss happened in 2022, pretty recent in memory. As TV crews filmed Abe's speech, a man named Tetsuya Yamagami stepped out from behind him and shot Shinzo Abe with a homemade double-barrel firearm, which he had assembled himself. The event was deeply disturbing, with multiple angles of the attack airing on national television within the hour, and going viral on social media almost instantly. You could have been standing in that crowd, listening to his speech, when suddenly a loud bang cut everything off, with the screams of the crowd replacing what was just moments ago, a fully live and breathing individual speaking to his people. It's just incredibly eerie. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of people know of this event with it being so recent, but aren't aware of why it happened at all. As without this background, you may think this was an estranged killing over differing politics, but that's not quite it at all. To understand why Shinzo Abe died, you have to go back almost 40 years earlier, which is with a family in Nara. Tetsuya Yamagami was 4 years old when his father took his own life. In 1991, his mother found religion, specifically the Unification Church. And over the years that followed, she gave it everything she had. That includes things like insurance payouts from her husband's death, the money from her family business, the land she owned, etc. She gave around 100 million yen, and actually declared bankruptcy in 2002. By Yamagami's own account, the household had simply ran out of money. By giving all she had to the Unification Church, she left Yamagami with no food in the house, an older brother who was half blind in his left eye after suffering childhood cancer, and Yamagami himself, who was a strong student that ended up not making it into university because his mother gave away all the money to this church. He ended up joining the Maritime Self-Defense Force, which left him incredibly depressed and with a ploy that would leave his siblings to collect his life insurance. However, he survived his bout with depression, but 10 years later, his brother didn't. So that's the man standing behind Abe with a homemade gun. 41 years old, completely alone in his life after a really difficult upbringing, and a now 30-year grudge against this church. Which now raises the obvious question, what the hell am I talking about? What is the Unification Church that I keep bringing up? Well, if you haven't seen my Korean cults video, this is a cult. This is not a church. This is a complete cult that steals money from its members, just like they did to Yamagami's mother. Although this is a Korean cult, which was founded in Seoul in 1954 by Sun Myung-moon, a man who said Jesus appeared to him on a Korean mountainside when he was 15 and asked him to do stuff like scamming the elderly. I don't really understand, but it's obviously bullshit. So yeah, this is a cult that spread out of Korea and into Japan with the prime goal to just make as much money as possible. But in that goal, the cult ended up making a lot of friends in the Japanese government, with one of them being Shinzo Abe. If you want to know more about this cult in particular, do check out my Korean cults video, but maybe I'll make a Japanese cults video, so just let me know about that below. But Yamagami's first target wasn't Abe at all. It was Hak Jahan, Moon's widow and the church's living leader. But the pandemic had actually kept her out of Japan for a few years, and obviously you can't travel abroad with a homemade weapon like that, so he went down a level. The day before the shooting, he mailed a letter to a blogger who campaigned against the church. In it, he wrote, "Abe is not my enemy in essence, but that Abe was, in his view, one of the church's most influential sympathizers in the real world." And that was enough for him. Within weeks, a lot of reporters connected the dots, which led the ruling party to run a survey in on itself, which they found that of its 379 members in parliament, 179, nearly half, turned out to have some documented contact with the church or its affiliates. A lot of ministers resigned because of this, and the government went after the church itself in October of 2023, formally asking it to strip the church's legal status. In March of 2025, the Tokyo District Court actually ordered the church to disband, which the church appealed and lost, then appealed again and lost again. So, on June 23rd, 2026, about a month before this recording, you'll be delighted to know that this religious organization, or cult, would be one of the first in history to be ordered by the courts to disband, which is actually kind of good. That's crazy. The Japanese parliament also passed a law targeting the exact kind of course of donation gathering that had swallowed the Yamagami family, so a lot of good kinda came from this. Hak Jahan, the woman that Yamagami actually set out to kill, well, as of this recording, she's in a detention center too, in Seoul, on trial for allegedly bribing South Korea's former first lady with designer handbags and an expensive necklace. She denies it, but prosecutors are asking for 13 years. A pretty good ending to a really disturbing assassination. It's the afternoon of June 18th, 1985, and outside an apartment building in Osaka, somewhere between 30 and 40 reporters and camera crews are packed into the 5th floor corridor and street below, waiting to film an arrest. Inside the apartment is Japan's most hated man, and word has gone around that the police will finally come from today. However, instead, at about 4:30, two men nobody recognized walk up the corridor, holding a 15-inch bayonet from the old Imperial Army. The man inside the apartment was Kazuo Nagano, a 32-year-old chairman and founder of a company called Toyota Shōji. No relation whatsoever to the car maker Toyota, but this is actually something he's done on purpose. See, he picked the name Toyota to borrow the fame and prestige of the car makers. And it's this fact alone that'll probably make you realize that he probably isn't the most stand-up guy. Nagano was born in 1952 in Gifu Prefecture, and worked a string of ordinary jobs but ended up getting fired from a trading company for speculating with client money, and in April of 1981 founded a company built on doing that at a national scale. What he sold was something called the Pure Gold Family Certificate. Customers were told that they were buying a physical gold bullion, which the company would then kindly store on their behalf, paying 10 to 15% a year for the privilege. Except there was no gold. New customers' money paid the returns owed to the old ones, and the rest went to salaries, real estate, and Nagano, which is what's called a Ponzi scheme. Nagano's sales team overwhelmingly targeted the elderly who were often living alone, and once they'd identified a target they liked, the salesmen were then dispatched to their homes, trained by internal company videos to refuse to leave without a signature. Their pitches ran for hours, and sometimes overnight, with some salesmen reportedly telling elderly women to think of them as their own son, which is just incredibly messed up, because they've specifically identified and targeted elderly people who are living alone, probably don't have much connection with their families, or have estranged sons. It's just really messed up targeting, and it's what his entire company was built on. By the end, nearly all of their elderly targets handed the company somewhere around 200 billion yen. Their life savings, their retirement money, the funds they set aside for their own funerals. Some victims were stripped of completely everything, leaving them with nothing else to live for. By June of 1985, the company was under criminal investigation and weeks from formal bankruptcy. Nagano had been questioned by the police days earlier and now was effectively hiding in his own 5th floor apartment, with the arrest expected any day. So, being one of Japan's most hated individuals at this point, the media set up camp outside his door and just waited for the police to arrive. However, that was when two men arrived first. Astro Laida, a 56-year-old man who ran a small ironworks, and Masakazu Yano, a 30-year-old who was a construction worker under his wing. Several of the people Toyota Shōji had bled dry were Laida's own former employees, and the two would later claim that 6 of those victims had told them to forget about recovering the money and to just kill Nagano. And they didn't hide these intentions at all. Standing in front of the assembled press, they announced what they had come to do, and then they began kicking in the aluminum frame window beside the door, smashing the glass, and climbing inside. You can hear the reporters on the recording shouting to stop and wait and for somebody to call the police, but what you can't hear is anybody putting down the camera to stop them, because deep down, nobody likes Nagano. Now, despite all the cameras there, the killing actually happened inside the room and out of frame of view of any of the people recording. And all you can see is a couple minutes later, the two men climbing back out with blood across their clothes, and one of them reportedly shouting that this was divine punishment. The police then arrived and arrested them on the spot, but Nagano had been stabbed repeatedly with the bayonet they were holding and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. A still photo taken through the broken window of one of the men grabbing Nagano ran nationwide, and the footage replayed all evening. An NHK announcer on air reportedly shouted, "Don't let children see this." Laida the elder got 10 years, and Yano got 8. Both sentences were finalized by the decade, both men served them, and both of them are walking free today. Some theorized that this was some sort of organized crime conspiracy, because with Nagano dead, the map to the money died too. However, the police never found any evidence of this, but the 200 billion yen was never fully traced, and the victims only got back a small fraction of it. The company was declared bankrupt within the following month, and 5 of its executives went to prison for fraud, 10 to 13 years each. In February of 2013, talk shows across Japan couldn't stop talking about one incredibly disturbing video. a video of a TV star and idol of one of the biggest pop groups in Japan crying with a shaved head while she bows to the camera again and again, apologizing. This is Minami Minegishi, an idol from the group AKB48. They had a massive TV presence in Japan, with producers investing a lot into their variety show that aired quite frequently on TV, and was one of their biggest advertisements for what they called idols you could meet. See, most idols in Japan at the time were seen as untouchable stars. You went to their shows and that was pretty much it. But producers knew how parasocial fans were, and that they should begin using this to their advantage. Today, meet and greets with fans are something much more common due to how much money it brings in for these agencies. But AKB48 in specifically is entirely built around this. And with how much money these parasocial fans bring in for the agency, it's obviously expected that appeasing them is priority number one. And the thought that one of their perfect idols would have something like, God forbid, a boyfriend was completely out of the question. So AKB48 made it a rule. You're not allowed to date at all, full stop. This wasn't just an informal understanding or anything, it was a condition of membership that you agreed to when you joined the group. And breaking this rule had actually already been enforced. The year before, one of the group's most popular members, Rino Sashihara, was caught in a tabloid dating story and forcibly transferred hundreds of miles away to a less prestigious sister group in southern Japan, making the message pretty clear. If you break this rule, you're severely punished. On January 31st, 2013, the tabloid Shunkan Bunshin ran photos of Minegishi leaving the apartment of her boyfriend, a 19-year-old in another group. Management saw this and saw that she'd be punished within the day. She was stripped of her spot on Team A and demoted all the way down to a research student, which is a trainee level for kids who had just walked in the door. Minegishi had been with the group since she was 13, and literally in their main team, Team A. This was seen as incredibly intense punishment already, but then the video went up on AKB48's official YouTube channel. Minegishi, with her head shaved to the scalp, she bows and cries in front of the camera, apologizing to fans and her fellow members, saying she wasn't thinking straight when she read the story, and that she just shaved her head. She's careful to say that it was her decision, and that she begs to be allowed to stay. But what's actually incredible about this is that the video hit 4 million views in a single day. The footage and the stills were on the front pages and on talk shows within hours, an incredibly disturbing sight and look into the entertainment industry in Japan. It's just incredibly disturbing, and I can't imagine watching these talk shows on TV discuss this. Like, these guys are also on TV, and you get to see this horrible look at what it's like backstage for a lot of these talents. It's just a little unnerving. A lawyer in the Japan Times pointed out at the time that the no dating clause was actually probably illegal under Japanese labor law. But it's kinda difficult to enforce that, to be honest, as the companies could make up 100 excuses for things that don't seem like punishment to outsiders, but nevertheless, no one actually really did anything with that claim anyway. It's just a little unfortunate that despite the fact that this rule is basically illegal, nobody can do anything about it. One thing that went unresolved was whether the video was really her idea at all. Some entertainment journalists at the time openly asked whether the whole thing was encouraged by the production side, given how efficiently a scandal turned into 4 million views and a sympathy cycle that actually ultimately ended up saving her career. That suspicion was never confirmed or denied, but this isn't the first time that I personally have actually seen this. Ohori Megumi was an idol who was actually one of the least popular in the group due to her age, this being the exact same group, AKB48. Now, while most idols were teenagers, she was in her mid-20s, and she was under threat of being let go for just being far too unpopular. And so the management put her through an incredibly degrading cycle of events in order to save her career, which actually worked. I believe the producers are willing to play big political moves in order to assure their talent keeps popular, even if it means putting the talent through something incredibly horrific, something they may have only agreed to simply because disagreeing meant losing their job. Minegishi did keep her spot thanks to this video, and by August she was back on the team as a full member, captain of the newly formed Team 4, with a new batch of trainees under her, eventually known as the Minegishi Children. She stayed at AKB48 until 2021, being one of the last founding members to leave. Her career saved, all while that incredibly disturbing video was quietly deleted from the official YouTube channel. On August 12, 1985, JAL Flight 123 took off from Tokyo Haneda headed for Osaka, a destination it unfortunately never made. Most plane crashes are total accidents, but it's commonly agreed upon by experts that JAL Flight 123 is a flight that should have never even made it to the runway in the first place. And to understand why, we have to go back 7 years. In 1978, this same aircraft, the exact same Boeing 747, scrapes its tail on a landing in Osaka, in an incident that's called a tail strike. The impact damaged a component in the rear of the plane, which holds the pressurized cabin together. After the flight, Boeing sent out a repair team, and they were supposed to fix it. Except they didn't. Instead of the double row of rivets that the approved repair procedure specifies, they only installed a single row. The repair passes inspection, somehow, and the aircraft is cleared and returned to service. For the next 7 years, that plane flies hundreds of flights with thousands of passengers, and somehow, just out of sheer luck, the faulty bulkhead holds. But slowly, with every takeoff and landing, and every pressurization cycle, it's slowly working it down, stressing the metal in ways that a correctly repaired bulkhead would never experience. And somehow, nobody notices this. August 12th, 1985, Flight 123 departs from Haneda at 6:12 p.m. with 524 people aboard, packed ahead of the Obon holiday, one of the busiest travel periods in Japan. Among said passengers is Kyu Sakamoto, the singer of Sukiyaki, the only Japanese language song to ever top the US Billboard Hot 100. Now 12 minutes after takeoff at cruising altitude, the weakened bulkhead finally gives out. The explosion tears away most of the aircraft's vertical tail fin and severs all 4 hydraulic control lines, and so simultaneously, the crew now has no flight controls. Nothing is working. The only thing they have left is the engines, which they try to steer by using a varying thrust between them, but it doesn't work well enough. The aircraft simply spends its time going up and down over a long period for the next 32 minutes. The crew does send a distress call, and air traffic control manages to track them, but there's nothing anyone on the ground can do. They're unable to descend accurately, unable to reach any airport, and just as I said before, keep rising and falling over and over again. The passengers are aware that something is catastrophically wrong, with several of them spending the next 32 minutes writing farewell notes to their families. At 6:56 p.m., the aircraft strikes Osutaka Ridge, a remote, heavily forested mountain in Gunma Prefecture, which is about 100 kilometers northwest of Tokyo. The plane disintegrates on impact. 520 people are dead. It remains to this day the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. But air traffic control knew the impact site was somewhere in those mountains, and they knew something else. Based on the trajectory and the speed and where the tail section had separated, it was entirely plausible that people seated near the rear of the aircraft had actually survived. Not likely, but plausible. And so what followed afterwards was a live national television event, with it already turning nighttime by the time the wreckage was located, and the terrain just being so remote and heavily forested with no roads. Broadcasters ran continuous coverage through the night, with hours of helicopter footage circling Osutaka Ridge in the dark. Searchlights moved across a lot of the trees, waiting for any signs of the aircraft, and Japan sat and watched in real time as rescuers searched for the possibility that there may be survivors. The helicopters could see smoke, but they couldn't land, and ground teams were still hours away, and so the people watching on TV at home sat in frustration, watching for any signs of life while the rescue teams wouldn't reach the wreckage until the following morning, roughly 14 hours after impact. But when they got there, they found 4 survivors, a group of women who were all seated near the rear of the aircraft. The nation that had sat and watched TV all night for that answer finally had at least somewhat good news and a nice conclusion. As terrible as the crash was, the payoff that at least a small group of survivors came out of that horrific crash, one of the most horrific crashes in history, is something just thank God for, you know? The crash site on Osutaka Ridge is still a memorial, with JAL staff and victims' families climbing it every August 12th to pay their respects. For context on how rare gun violence is in Japan, in 2021, the entire country recorded just 1 firearm-related death. In the US of the same year, it was over 45,000. Japan essentially has no gun culture, legal or otherwise. There's almost no history of mass violence in public spaces, which is in part why of what happened in Akihabara on June 8, 2008 that hit the country as hard as it did. Tomohiro Kato was 25 and grew up in Aomori, son of a bank manager and a strong student and athletic as a kid, making it a surprise to everyone when he failed his university entrance exams and ended up at a temp at a factory. After a string of unstable dispatch jobs, he grew up in isolation through his 20s and began having an obsessive habit of posting on mobile phone internet bulletin boards describing his loneliness, his resentment, and his sense that his life had gone completely wrong beyond fixing. In the weeks before the attack, the posts got a lot darker and a lot more specific. He writes about what he's planning, but nobody on the forum takes him seriously. And then 2 days before, he drives to a military supply store in Fukui and buys a hunting dagger. Surveillance footage from the store, layered later on Japanese television, shows him chatting and joking with the clerk at the counter, and at one point miming stabbing motions. He drives back the day before the attack and goes to Akihabara. He sells his own laptop to fund the trunk rental, and on the morning of June 8th, still behind the wheel, he posts one final message onto the internet. It's time. Akihabara, on a Sunday afternoon, is closed to traffic. The whole main strip turns into a pedestrian mall that's packed with electronic shoppers and tourists, and it's just a main tourist attraction. I'm sure if you've ever thought about going to Japan, going to Akihabara is something that crosses your mind, as it's one of the main tourist locations. But it's also one of the most photographed crowds in Japan on any given weekend, with almost everyone there having a camera. At 12:33 p.m, Kato runs a red light and drives the truck straight into the crossing, hitting 5 people. Assuming that this is an accident, a lot of people run in to help the victims, which is when Kato exits the vehicle with his dagger and begins stabbing the people running in to try help. Witnesses say he's screaming while he does it, and the police corner him in an alley about 170 meters from the truck and arrest him at the scene. This whole thing happened in roughly 2 minutes, with 3 people being killed by the truck and 4 more by stabbing, with around 10 others being injured. To police afterwards, Kato says he came to Akihabara to kill people, and that it hadn't mattered to him who. He's sentenced to death in 2011. The sentence holds through appeal, and he's executed by hanging on July 26, 2022. The thing about this is the line I said earlier, that everyone in Akihabara had a phone. And it's this exact moment that Japanese media analysis had cited the Akihabara attack as the specific moment when crowdsourced unfiltered atrocity footage entered the national media ecosystem. Before this, something happened in public and it would be filmed by a news crew and go through a broadcast and obviously get censored. But here, people began opening Ustream and streaming the attack, which just completely bypasses that TV aspect. This was a live stream. People were streaming this incident happening live. It's really disturbing. But what's really horrible about this case is it's clearly the attack of someone who just had nobody to take them seriously in life, nobody to love them, nobody to let them keep going, and everything he did up until the attack, he's on these forums telling people, he's talking to the store clerk, telling him what he's going to do, and it seems like nobody sees this man for who he is, for the person who's struggling, and nobody's there to help him, nobody reaches out, nobody takes him seriously. It's really hard to put into words, but every time I see things like this, it's always the signs were there, and never someone stepped in to stop them and help them. I know this case is less about TV, and more about the footage aspect. The fact that this was streamed was a hot topic in Japan talk shows for a long time, and this was talked about on TV quite a lot, making for a lot of discussion. But the fact that people turned on live streams and just began filming is why I decided to put it into this iceberg. It's essentially an atrocity that marked the moment that Japanese TV didn't have total control anymore. In May of 1970, Japanese television began broadcasting a live hostage situation. A man boarded a ferry armed with a rifle and forced the ferry out to sea with more than 40 passengers and crew on board. For the next 24 hours, he would stay out there firing at passing vessels and police helicopters in one of the most intense hostage broadcasts in Japanese history. A broadcast which would end in a way no viewer had ever expected. Kawafuji Nobuhisa, a 20-year-old man whose past peers and school records all described as someone with almost no impulse control. A man who was pretty easily led and just had poor moral judgment all around. Teachers had been writing that about him since he was a child, and by his 20s, he'd cycled through reform institutions and juvenile facilities constantly. He's had over 20 burglary incidents, as well as serving a 2-year prison term. So how does a small-time burglar end up in a nationally televised standoff at sea? Well, after a 3-day chain of events, with each one being worse than the last, this is how we got here. On May 10th, Kawafuji and 2 teenagers he'd met at a pachinko parlor decided to steal a car in Fukuoka and head east. With the car obviously being reported stolen, on May 11th, just after midnight, police stopped the car at a highway checkpoint in Yamaguchi Prefecture. They of course realize it's stolen, and as they're taking him in, Kawafuji suddenly pulls out a concealed hunting rifle and stabs the officer in the chest, and he runs with one of the teenagers, with the other being arrested on the spot, and thankfully the officer who was hurt did survive. But Kawafuji did escape. May 12th, the following morning, he's cornered again in Hiroshima when he takes the driver of a passing car hostage at gunpoint and forces him to drive him free. somehow in the process of all this, he managed to steal a gun from one of the police officers. However, the second teenager that Kawafuji ran away with is actually arrested, which means that Kawafuji is now all alone, armed with a rifle, a shotgun, and now a police pistol. And because of all these terrible actions, the entire prefecture is now looking for him, and his options, especially on land, are now running thin. So Kawafuji, thinking he has nowhere to go, decides to go to Hiroshima port and boards the ferry Prince with roughly 40 passengers and crew on board, forcing it out to sea, in which the standoff begins. The next 24 hours are total chaos, with Kawafuji firing at passing vessels, firing at police helicopters circling overhead, and we get to watch this with news cameras tracking the ferry across the Seto Inland Sea while the whole country watches it home. At one point, he sails the ferry all the way to Matsuyama port in Ehime. That is a strange one to pronounce. I'm trying, but some things are hard to pronounce, and I apologize. Anyway, when he reaches this port, he actually releases some of the passengers, which no one expected. He didn't need to do that, he just did it, and for some reason, this is never fully explained. But after letting some passengers off, he turns the ferry around and heads back towards Hiroshima. Most people suggest at this point that he'd simply run out of a plan, but I don't really know if there ever really was a plan. I mean, what can he really do at this point? He can't go anywhere on land, the police are all looking for him, and so he turns to the sea. But helicopters are faster than boats, so they can just know where he's going at all times. He's kinda out of options, and he's just going between ports at this point. Now, as the ferry approaches Hiroshima, and the news cameras are all watching, a police sniper, brought in from Osaka for the operation, takes the shot, and Kawafuji is killed on the deck, live on national television. It's a pretty shocking and abrupt ending. You wouldn't really expect that, especially when you're watching from home live. I couldn't imagine watching something like that and it suddenly just all comes to an end. The most annoying thing about this case is that there isn't really any why. The police officer was stabbed because he was being arrested. He took that man hostage because he was surrounded by police. And then he took the ferry hostage because there was nowhere else on land to go. The only question here that remains unanswered is, why on earth steal the car in the first place? From what I can understand, the two teenagers that were involved in this don't have any public confession at all anywhere because they were minors. And in Japan, they just don't release anything if you're a minor, with their names just being attributed to boy A and boy B, and they vanish from the story completely, with really no coverage of their trial, no interviews or anything. So we don't know why they stole the car, just that they were friends with Kawafuji and picked a bad time to hang out with him. They were just petty criminals and they stole a car because that's what they did. It's just a couple unfortunate turn of events, which began with a terrible decision to steal a car. On the night of June 13th, 2009, Japanese wrestling fans tuned in expecting an ordinary title match, but what aired instead became one of the most disturbing broadcasts in the history of the sport. Wrestling in Japan isn't like how we treat it in the West. To them, it's more like sumo or boxing, whereas we treat it as, being a fake. But in Japan, it's covered in the sports pages and their champions are mainstream athletes. And in the 1990s, Mitsuharu Misawa was one of their top wrestlers. Misawa has been a star since the 1980s, a multi-time national champion, and by the 2000s, he was a founder and president of his own wrestling company, Pro Wrestling Noah. See, by 2009, Misawa wasn't a performer anymore. He was the boss of the company, and he'd left wrestling partly behind him. I mean, he was 46 years old and reportedly struggling with neck and shoulder injuries. But the thing is that it was Misawa's name which was selling out stadiums. He was selling to people who wanted to see that era of wrestling again. His style from those eras was escalating physical punishment, hard strikes and suplexes that, might not look as real in today's wrestling. He was selling stadiums because he was really pushing it. If he stopped this to take a step back because of this neck and shoulder injuries that he was suffering from, then maybe he stopped selling out stadiums too. So Misawa continued to push himself. And on June 13th, 2009, at an event in Hiroshima, all those years of pushing it finally caught up to him. Misawa was in a tag team title match, and about 25 minutes in, his opponent hit him with a backdrop suplex. I don't know anything about wrestling, but the report says this is a pretty standard move, and one that Misawa had taken over 1,000 times in his career. But when he got hit with it this time, Misawa just didn't get back up again. The referee stopped the match immediately, and a ringside doctor began CPR in the ring, in front of a full arena and on the live broadcast. It's fairly common for the crowd to cheer the downed wrestler's name in an effort to will them back up to their feet. However, in this case, what's really disturbing about the footage that you see in this is that the person they're chanting for is already dead. it may be somewhat reassuring to know that no one was persecuted for this, and the opponent who did that didn't suffer for it. This was just Misawa pushing it too hard, and no one really acknowledges that anyone had done anything wrong or Misawa had done anything wrong. It's just a case of pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and when you get these aging stars with, they have to keep going for financial reasons, and there's nobody with the authority to really stop them since it's his own company, it's just a really unfortunate turn of events, and unfortunately something that was bound to happen eventually with all the injuries that he was suffering from, and he just kept pushing through so he could keep affording to run his company. It's just one of the more unfortunate cases on this list that doesn't really sit right with me. Earlier on this list, we talked about Johnny and Associates, and I think that gave you somewhat of an uneasy idea of how the entertainment industry worked, with how they forced a hostage-style apology from their talent for suggesting to leave, and then when they did leave, going on to blacklist them from TV. But what Johnny Kitagawa himself got up to behind the scenes runs so much deeper. This is the Johnny Kitagawa cover-up case, one of the most disturbing behind-the-scenes pedophile rings in TV history. For almost 60 years, Johnny Kitagawa was basically in charge of deciding who got to be famous in Japan. As mentioned earlier, he founded Johnny & Associates, the talent agency, in 1962. They basically managed most, if not all, of the top idol boy bands in Japan, and they usually trained up their stars from a young age through years of practice using templates built by Johnny himself. Which isn't something you want to hear about a man who, after he died, was hit with a massive investigation to his company over the sexual abuse of male trainees in his agency. Now, this wasn't something that only came about after he died. In 1965, the parents of 4 boys tried to sue him over similar accusations. In 1988, a former member of boy band 4 Leaves, Koji Kita, published a memoir describing sexual advances Kitagawa made against him and other boys under contract. Then, in October of 1999, the magazine Shukan Bunshun ran a lengthy investigation series built on accounts from about a dozen former trainees alleging a pattern of sexual abuse going back years. Kitagawa sued the magazine publisher for libel in 2002, and the Tokyo District Court actually ruled in his favor and awarded him damages. The publisher then appealed, and in July of 2003, the Tokyo High Court thankfully threw out most of that ruling. The judges found the sexual abuse allegations to actually be substantially true, and the only part in the original reporting that they still considered defamatory was a comparatively minor claim that Kitagawa let underage teenagers drink and smoke, which is obviously nothing compared to the main concern here. But even after this, even after the case was pushed even further to Japan's Supreme Court, still nothing actually happened of this. No criminal case was ever brought in, mostly because no victim or parent ever actually filed one. And Japan's television networks and major newspapers, with very slim exceptions, simply didn't touch the story or its implications for the next 2 decades. And if you're wondering why, it's because Johnny & Associates manages everything. They have such a stranglehold over the entertainment industry, with nearly every major broadcaster relying on Johnny & Associates' talent to fill its variety shows and dramas and music programs. And if that story leaks and they start reporting on it, they lose access to some of the biggest stars in the country that are keeping their shows going. Kitagawa died of a stroke in July of 2019 at 87 years old, something we discussed earlier, and he never spent a day answering for any of this in criminal court. But what finally came about was in March of 2023, the BBC aired a documentary called Predator, The Secret Scandal of J-Pop. Since this was a British documentary, there was no need to be fearful of Johnny & Associates. There's nothing to be scared of because there's really no repercussions that can be faced from talking about this. And so, everything was laid out to the public for the first time in history. After this documentary, a month later, on April 12th, a Japanese-Brazilian singer named Koan Okamoto held a press conference at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. He'd said he joined the agency in 2012 at 15 years old, but over that following 4 years, he was sexually assaulted somewhere between 15 and 20 times. He described a kind of house code among the boys who stayed over at Kitagawa's residence, which is just really an unnerving thought that these trainees are actually going to his residence. When Kitagawa told one of them to go to bed early, everyone else understood what that meant. And Okamoto said he watched well over 100 other trainees pass through that same house over those 4 years, and he believed that most of them went through the same thing as him. Okamoto was one of the first accusers in decades willing to put his real name on it and, come forward with anything. And it was this press conference that gave everyone else the power to come forward. In August of 2023, an outside panel commissioned by the agency itself, led by a former prosecutor general, concluded that Kitagawa had been abusing boys as far back as the 1950s, continuing into the 2010s, with a victim count likely running up into the hundreds, which is just incredibly horrifying. A little over a week, Julie Fujishima, who had run the agency since his death, resigned as president, specifically because the panel said that the family's control of the company itself was part of the problem. Japan's biggest broadcasters, including public broadcaster NHK, then issued their own apologies for decades of silence, and that the network admitted that the legal findings on the sexual assault had already been confirmed back in 2004, and they just didn't say anything about it, just out of fear. By October of 2023, the Johnny's & Associates company had split up, with most of the talent dropping the name Johnny's if they held onto it, and the company basically split into two different companies, one owned still by Johnny's family and niece, and another being launched as something else. This is just a really disturbing case where audiences could be watching these variety shows, not knowing the horrors that their favorite idols were facing behind the scenes, and what they had to go back to after filming. And I suppose, after so many decades of silence, at the very least, we can be thankful it's all over. Kim Hui-ro was born in November of 1928 in Shizumu on Japan's Shizuoka coast. He was a second-generation ethnic Korean resident of Japan, and during this time, Koreans in Japan often faced systematic discrimination, and even those born there could not claim full Japanese citizenship and felt treated as outsiders, even for someone like Kim, who speaks perfect Japanese. Kim's father died in a construction accident in 1931, when Kim was 2. He dropped out of elementary school in 5th grade after years of racial bullying from Japanese classmates. By 1943, he was still a young teenager and had been arrested for theft and sent to a reformatory. He continued the cycle of petty crime into adulthood, and for much of his life in Japan, he used a separate Japanese-sounding alias, Kondo Yasuhiro, a common practice among Koreans at the time. On February 23, 1968, at a club called Minx in Shizumu's entertainment district, Kim met with members of the Yanagawa Gumi, a yakuza syndicate, over an unpaid debt. By his account afterward, they had threatened him and hurled ethnic slurs at him during the confrontation. During this, Kim actually opened fire with a rifle and killed both men. Horrified at what he'd done, Kim fled into the mountains, and by the next day had broken into the Fujimiya Ryokan, a hot spring at Sumatakyo, deep in the hills of Shizuoka Prefecture. He was armed with a Howa M300 rifle, a licensed Japanese copy of the American M1 carbine, as well as a supply of dynamite. He took 13 people hostage, including the innkeeper's family and guests staying there that week. Then, Kim called the police on himself to tell them where he was. Over the next several days, Kim gave a number of live televised interviews from inside the hostage room. He used his new platform to draw public attention to the discrimination of Korean residents of Japan. His main demand was that police publicly apologize on camera for discriminatory remarks officers had made about Koreans in the past. Since this was 1968, I don't actually have the footage for this, but it is in the record that 2 police officers actually apologized on national TV. He released the hostages gradually as the days wore on, and by the time police moved in, there were only 6 hostages remaining. The siege ran for about 88 hours, and on February 24th, officers disguised as reporters entered the room and arrested Kim without any further violence. He was charged with murder, unlawful confinement, and explosive violations. The Shizuoka District Court sentenced him to life imprisonment on June 17, 1973. He served 31 years, and in September of 1999, at 70 years old, he was paroled on the condition that he never set foot in Japan again. He was deported to South Korea, and there he dropped the name Kim and went back to using his birth name, Kwon Hui-ro. He was actually treated quite well in Korea, with a lot of the press and public hailing him as a folk hero. In 2000, about a year after his return, Kwon was arrested again though, this time in Busan, in connection to breaking into a former lover's apartment and attacking her husband. He served more time before eventually being released. He died of prostate cancer in a Busan hospital on March 26, 2010, at 81 years old. It's real sad that he had a nice chance to turn his life around, and he went ahead and got arrested again. But I suppose it's really hard for someone who spent their whole life committing petty crimes because they were discriminated against for most of their life. It might have been hard for him to find work growing up in that time, and conditioning over so many years, it's easy to see how someone could have had that initial snap that he did, not saying that it's right, just that it's easy to see, and how he would struggle to get out of it even after being given a completely clean slate. It's just a bit of a sad story of someone who seemed to struggle a lot, and at the very least I'm glad he didn't hurt any of those hostages and that he got to spend his final years in Korea. Mount Unzen is a volcano in Nagasaki Prefecture that had been dormant for roughly 2 centuries. However, in November of 1999, steam was seen rising from the summit, but most people in the area just expected it to fade out, officials included. The concept that this 2-century dormant volcano would randomly erupt just wasn't a thought that crossed people's minds. But they would see how wrong they were on May of 1991, when a lava dome appeared at the top of the summit and began to become unstable. It began throwing something off called pyroclastic flows. These are like avalanches of hot dust and gas that flow down the sides of a mountain. They move way faster than a person can run and are often even faster than a car, which means they're some of the most dangerous and lethal things that can come out of a volcano. All this smoke you're seeing is literally just hot gas, lava, and rock, and as dangerous as it is an incredible sight to see. With the entire town being evacuated, that didn't mean anything for the reporters and camera crews who came to see this exact amazing scene. These reporters started gathering in a spot in the village of Kitagawa, about 4 kilometers from the lava dome, with a clear close view of the eruption. Then, on the 26th of May, monitoring officials warned journalists that the place they were stationed at, named the Fixed Point, carried a real risk of being hit by a larger flow, and that they needed to relocate immediately. The Asahi team moved to a safer position on May 28th, however most other crews didn't. They stayed or kept coming back to the same spot in the following days, just hoping to get that perfect shot of the eruption. Then, on the afternoon of June 3rd, the flow started coming more often. The ash and rain had already cut visibility down to almost nothing, but then at 4:08 PM, a flow broke loose that was way bigger than anything the mountain had produced so far, traveling roughly at 4.8 kilometers from the crater. Cameras were rolling when it hit, and several of the press crews caught in the flow had been filming the eruption the exact moment it reached them. One of them was Maurice Kraft, a French volcanologist who'd actually been given an interview shortly before his death. In it, he'd said he'd watched eruptions for so many years that he wasn't afraid anymore, not even if it meant dying in the next one. 43 people were killed or went missing. 16 worked in media, most of them were reporters and photographers, or just members of the camera crew. 12 were volunteer firefighters who'd gone to the danger zone to stand by, some of them specifically trying to get the press to leave. 4 were taxi drivers who'd been driving press crews in and out of the area. 3 were volcanologists, Maurice and Katia Kraft, and the American geologist Harry Gleichen. 2 were police officers sent in to help direct the evacuation, and 2 were local workers taking down an election poster board. The rest were farmers who were just working nearby. The bodies of the Krafts and Gleichen were recovered 2 days later near their rental car. The Krafts were found together, and Gleichen's body was some distance off, where police deduced he tried to run away, but being unable to outrun the volcano. Super Jockey was a Japanese variety show that ran on Nippon TV from January 1983 to March of 1999. It aired on every Sunday, from 1 PM to 2 PM in the afternoon. The host was Beat Takeshi, the stage name of Takeshi Kitano, who would become an award-winning film director to international audiences. But in Japan at that time, he was one of the biggest comedians in the country. The show started out as any other variety program, built around games and stunts with members of the public joining in. But that all changed once it introduced the segment it's now remembered for, the boiling water commercial. The rules worked like this. A guest who wanted to promote something on air, maybe a new single like a CD or a movie or a product, would spin a roulette wheel to decide who had to get into a bathtub filled with scalding hot water. Being the 1990s, this was usually some poor young girl, in order to buy time so that her and her friends could promote whatever they wanted to promote. And if the producers thought that they didn't do a good enough job or something, well, they would give them another round at getting into this scalding hot water, and it's just something a little ridiculous to watch. I know it's the 1990s, but it must just be so painful, and then you hear the producers say, "You have another chance." Like, I just can't imagine getting into that water a second time. Most of them only lasted about 20 seconds, so you can assume that is some hot water that just after 20 seconds of sitting in there and squirming and looking like they want to get out at any point, at 20 seconds they're calling it quits. So it just must be that hot. But whatever time they spent in the tub, it would then later count down during their promotion segment. Japanese television of this era was very much ridiculous. We've looked at a lot on this channel already, with Nasubi and Denpa Shonen, and I even did a whole video on game shows that just take it way too far. And this is probably one of the more tame things that I've actually looked at, which is worrying in its own way, but through the 1990s, the broadcasters in Japan came under growing pressure over this exact kind of content. There were a lot of shows that, as I just said, were worse, but one by one they were getting cancelled, and Super Jockey just so happened to outlive nearly all of them. holding its Sunday afternoon slot until March of 1999. A lot of these cases were pretty disturbing, and to be honest, I think some of them were a lot worse than what we saw in Volume 1. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and if you want to support the channel, I do have a Patreon which you can check out below. I do some extra content over there, so if you want to subscribe and help out, I do appreciate that. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.